Hello, today I'm going to talk to you about a topic which falls properly into American cultural history. I'm a professor of history at Arizona State University, but this is not the field in which I was trained. But it falls into that category because it really is reminiscences of experiences that I've had in the past as I grew up in rural southern Michigan. So the location where most of the events occurred, or the situations which I describe, are associated with the southeastmost township called Waukesha of Kalamazoo County in southern Michigan, just one county north of the Indiana line. And I would like today, particularly as the first topic, we may go to others, to talk about the one-room country school. You may not know that when territories like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Michigan became organized territories under the United States government, the federal Congress passed legislation as to how the land should be laid out, how it might be devised, and that was to be 1-mile sections of 640 acres each, a road around each section, and then townships 6 by 6, which would constitute many townships forming a county, and the county would have a county seat. In this case, it is Kalamazoo. So the first topic I would like to deal with today is the one-room country school, a very, very important institution in the rural Midwest and ought to be appreciated by those who grew up in the rural Midwest, whether they were in Kansas, Wisconsin, Ohio, or any number of other places. The closest town to the point where we are discussing today, a small one-room country school, is Fulton, a population of approximately 100, didn't vary more than 3 or 4 in the 10 years that will be involved in this particular discussion tonight. That was 1 mile and 1/4 to the north. Physically, the size of the school was enough to hold 30 desks, and I have outlined here a general layout of the school. So physically, you had a structure that would hold 30 desks, at least in 3 sizes because of the ages and size of the students. And your entry was here, a large cement platform. In front of that, a pump, which each fall, when classes started, one of the local farmers would come by with a bucket of water and would prime the pump so it would be working again for the school year. Things were a little different when it froze, of course. Right. Then your entry steps are here. And then there's an entryway here through which the bell from the belfry arch for calling the students can be rung by the teacher. And once you enter the actual classroom area, on this side a cloak closet or closet for boys, this side for girls. There would be a table here with 2 wash basins and 2 towels. And on this side a table which could be used for 3 or 4 people to read if they had finished their homework and were privileged to look at the Look magazine, Collier's, Life, and other things that were available or donated to the school. We didn't subscribe to those, couldn't afford it. Here would be a large table in which the teacher would call up each class during a sequence of the day. And the first, obviously, the youngest. So the kindergarten level, there never were any classes that were larger than 4 or 5, the total student body, usually 28 to 31 or 32 for the whole school, and that is 8 grades. So the teacher would spend time, 20 minutes with each one, and sequences of reading and mathematics and other things. Later in the day, it might be 6th, 7th, or 8th graders diagramming sentences on one of the chalkboards, which ran across here, and one large one in the rear. So you always participated in the education of others. You couldn't avoid that because you were always in a single room. So we're not talking about a very large operation here. The pot-bellied stove was the total heating for the entire school. In the rear, you see a lean-to, and the lean-to was divided, 1/5 of it or 1/4 of it was given to a large coal bin, and then part of it was used to stack wood when wood might be used. And then the other important commodity in the lean-to were 2 by 12 planks stored there, enough of them, along with blocks of wood or stump-type wood, and those were used to construct the stage that was placed here each Christmas for the Christmas play. And the stage was boarded off, of course, with donated large hanging sheets on wires so that you could give a production as big as it would be for a school of this type. So there wasn't a lot in terms of supplies, any way whatsoever. There was one closet in the rear, and that closet had several dictionaries, outdated National Geographic magazine, only a few books of one kind or another. The one most favorite to me was the one that dealt with the Crusades because it was illustrated and had pictures of all sorts of great battles, one kind or another. So that's the most that you had. The floors of this school were made of large 12-inch thick plank, and they were protected by sweeping them after throwing down oiled sawdust to keep down the dust, and that's the only protection that the floors had. So, used in that area, right? And planning or cleaning was always cooperative. So individuals rotated with regard to the sweeping of the school, which was done once a week. The school hours were 9 to 4. Couldn't start earlier than that because there were plenty of farm chores to be done. So that had to be taken care of as well. So 9 to 4 then. A 1-hour lunch hour, 12 to 1, 15-minute recess at 10:30, 15-minute recess at 2:30. But by then, in the afternoon, kindergartens went home at 11:30, and 2 o'clock, first graders went home. The rest all stayed until 4 o'clock. A variety of types of teachers could serve a school like this, but quite often you had a limited number of individuals with college educations in your community. So quite often the teacher was the wife of a local pastor who had also gone to college. And very importantly, it also learned to play the piano because the school did have a piano, and that was very important for group singing of one kind or another. And it was used for games and other things. So it was very important that teachers be Renaissance individuals, able to serve as the umpire for softball games, do a little coaching for track and field as you had it simply in those days, supervise all, play the piano, and teach a wide variety of subjects, because all subjects had to be offered and confined to a group of that type all the way up through the 8th grade. My favorite teacher was Miriam Burke, and I had her for 3 grades, and she was the wife of the local undertaker in Fulton, just north of the school. By the way, the school's name was Liggett. And as the Northwest Territory was laid out, states like Michigan, in each of your townships, there were 3 or 4 schools established, and it was dictated that a single 1 acre on a corner, but not always, would be set aside and fenced separate from the local fields around so that it could be used for the one-room country school. So this sat on 1 acre. Each fall, when classes would start on a Monday, on the Saturday before, with the proper mower that would be used for mowing hay, be it alfalfa, timothy, or clover, a farmer, volunteer, would come and mow all the grass on that 1 acre apart from the school. And then that's the only time it was mowed. There was enough action on the grass after that to take care of it, and besides, we are into the fall by that time. It's the only mowing that ever occurred. To the rear of the school, the largest grass area from the rear of the school back, had a ball diamond, which was used regularly, of course, and the paths were well worn. And just beyond that, but within about 15, 20 yards of the rear fence that separated a farmer's field from the school, would be 2 outdoor toilets, 2-hole variety. And that served the school. Inside the outdoor toilet, you could see where jackknives had carved the names of individuals or the initials of individuals from many years back who had attended that school. No writing, but carvings with jackknives. So that is essentially the plot, the layout, and the situation that you have in the one-room country school. A very, very important institution. The school was used for meetings of one kind or another, including the school board and other things, as well as the Christmas play. And very little election activities. Most went to Fulton for that type of activity as the head city for a town for the particular township. And townships are 6 miles in each direction. So there you have the general layout for the one-room country school. And I think everybody enjoyed going there. I attended the school for 7 grades until they consolidated schools. Now I'd like to tell you about some of the activities and recreations that you might have at school. And the first story I'd like to tell you involves snow. And as you all know, it snows plenty in Michigan. And so what does one do when you have 28 students confined to a single area and there's nothing but snow outside? You're still going to have a recess and you're still going to have the lunch hour. The hill was situated on a modest hill, and so the school, when the road packed down from driving by it, you could bring your sleds to school and obviously slide down the hill and all be very beneficial and very enjoyable. Also, after a new snow, one of the games that we played, very common, but it had to be a new snow, 2 individuals would be designated. They would move out, and there on the softball field, they would move around and create in the snow a gigantic circle. Then they would divide the circle like 6 pieces of pie. Now, from an aerial view, it would have the appearance of a Ferris wheel. Then everyone played tag, and no one was allowed to step on the fresh snow, only on the area that had been delineated. If anybody steps outside of the areas that have been cleared by shuffling feet, then they are it, and it is their turn to be it. That's one recreation that you could use for snow. There are many others that you might use, and one time we had such a heavy snow that the large bank that came down of grass from the school to the main highway that went by, and I say highway, we're talking about a 2-lane road that was not paved until 1940. As the bank sloped with drifting, there occurred a large amount of snow that came all the way out, and the county trucks that came by, they were large gravel trucks with a plow in the front to keep the roads cleared. And it was very important to keep the roads cleared because the federal government has regulations on post roads. And if the road weren't clear, a mailman who delivered in a rural route with his automobile would have to have his wife come along, and what road had been cleared, she would have to drive around a 1-mile section and pick him up on the other end, and he would have to walk in the snow 1 mile through to deliver to the 3 farms that happened to be there, because the law said post roads must be available for mail delivery. It might take an extra day before all roads were cleared by the county workers. Now, as county workers came by to plow these roads, they obviously mounded up more snow connected with the drift that came off the bank. And as a result, you could end up with 5 feet or more of snow that moved for maybe 15 yards over to the bank. And then you brought the proper shovels and you commenced to dig from the bank next to the road area that had been plowed, and you dug back until you hit the bank itself and then went up along the bank. Ultimately, you would be able to run out of school, jump into a hole, slide down to the base, and then crawl on out, and you would be on the road. So you could also dig tunnels. Then the next step, of course, would be to dig laterally and have tunnels move the other way as well. As this became colder and the snow solidified, these are very, very nice tunnels. The only damage would be done by new plowing. One occasion, when I was in the 5th grade, my brother in the 6th, and we were 2 of the 4 biggest boys in the school, we went out one time when the snow was packing particularly well and decided that we would lay a berm across the road with its packed snow. And we built the berm about 18 inches to 2 feet high. And then we sat back with all the other students, and when a car would come over the hill, it would be too late for the car to hit the brakes, and furthermore, the car wouldn't hit the brakes because you don't do that in snow. And as a result, the car would experience a tremendous bump, just like you going over a speed bump today. Well, that really was somewhat of a hazard, and it's something that should not have been done. So the individual who plowed the roads, his name was Dick Coburn, is a year older than my oldest brother, and they had been friends and had gone to school. Everyone knew everyone else in the community. And when Dick Coburn came by and saw the safety hazard that we had created, because something very bad could happen from that, especially driving in snow, he came into the school, called the teacher at that time, a Mrs. Smink, and she went out and talked with him in the hallway. And then she came back into the school, And she indicated that we would take shovels at that time and go out and knock down the berm and clear it completely away. I later found out from my brother, and Dick Colburn commented to my brother, that it was his inclination when he first talked to our teacher, Mrs. Smink, that he would like to have requested that he be able to single out the 4 largest boys in the school, one by one, take them behind the school, and give them a thorough whipping. The interesting thing about that is if he had chosen to request that, the teacher would have complied. That would have been carried out. And all 4 who received their whipping, there wouldn't be a one that would have made a comment about it to their parents. Because in a community like that, the parents, the teachers, all the others know what's good for the community. And conduct like that, if you did reveal it to your parents, would probably require a second whipping. So you wouldn't say anything about it. But of course, through my brother, I found out what might have happened in that little situation of mischief using the snow in one way or another. A second element with regard to the snow, you all are aware that when it's thawing and the snow is moist and there's plenty of it, you can build snowmen, you can build forts, have snowball fights from fort to fort, but you can also do things that are a little bit mischievous. Now, the 2 outdoor toilets, of course, had a single front door. And the most girls that you could put in one of those toilets, if you crowded them in, would probably be 8. And the kindergartners had already gone home. And as would be the tendency for boys to have snowball fights and throw snowballs at the girls. And so in a large snowball fight, all the girls sought refuge in their particular outdoor toilet. They would peer out the door from time to time, and of course, a flurry of snowballs would hit the crack in the door, and they would close it. But they were packed in there in all of their winter clothing, frazzled a little bit, and the time of the lunch hour began to dwindle till there was about 10 minutes left. And then we decided an interesting thing to do would be several of us start rolling up large snowballs, and if 5 or 6 of us pushed the ball, which continued to pick up more and more snow, by the time we moved it in front of the door, that ball of snow would be half as high as the door. Then we rolled another ball and together elevated it and put it on top of that one until we had gone all the way to the toilet's roof. Then we began packing more and more snow until finally the frontis of the toilet was impacted with several feet of snow. And then the bell rang, clang, clang, and all the boys ran in, took off their clothes, their coats and other things, put them in the closet, all sat down, and of course, no girls. And we all looked at each other and kind of smiled and snickered because the girls now are going to be in trouble. They are late and they didn't come in when the bell had rung. So we thought that was all very cute, and they came in about 10 minutes later after they had kicked their way out of the snow, all frazzled, literally sweating in their heavy clothing. And Mrs. Smink didn't say a word to them. And they filed in, put their clothing away, brushed their hair back, took their seats. Mrs. Smink said nothing. And so the day moved on to 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and finally it's time to go home, isn't it? It's 4 o'clock. And of course all the boys and the girls too would have farming chores they were responsible for and they had to be carried out. And most of them somewhere between 4:30 and 6:30, and supper coming after that. When it was 4 o'clock and it was time for everyone to leave, Mrs. Smink said, "It's time to go. All boys will remain in their seats." We looked at each other. We didn't know. The girls quietly got up, commenced to put on their winter clothes and other things to move on out. Of course, now it was their turn to stare at us and snicker, wasn't it? We stayed, they dressed, and left. And then Mrs. Smink, with her arms crossed, indicated that this was a special cleaning day at the school. And out came the materials for washing windows, for dusting, for sweeping the floors, everything to be tidied up. Even wood was restacked in a neater way in the lean-to, and all of us worked for an hour and a half after school, which means something else. We arrived home late to do chores, didn't we? So now we were in trouble on a second level. But Mrs. Smink handled it in a very, very subtle way, saying nothing of any kind. Now, she played the piano. She was a well-educated woman, and she was an absolute master of the school. And in each case, there was discipline. It would be handled in a subtle way, or it may be handled in a direct way. I remember on one occasion when I was a fifth grader, and we had put up all the planks and had built a stage for the Christmas play. Now it's time to rehearse for the Christmas play. Everybody having one part or another, playing some character at the important nativity time. But I chose to do some silly things, was disrupting the rehearsal in one way or another, and Mrs. Smink had had enough. She turned very quickly, slapped me across the face sufficiently hard that it knocked me off the stage. There was silence. I got back up on the stage, did exactly what I was supposed to do, kept my mouth closed. I never reported that, nor did my brother, to my mother or father, because their attitude would have been the same as Mrs. Smink's, and you would have merely aggravated your particular problems if you did something of that type. So that an example of some of the activities in the one-room country school. Other things of interest. If it were rainy weather, but it wasn't yet quite winter time as such, then you didn't go outside and you stayed inside. Games were concocted of one kind or another, and the most common game to be played was called clap them in and clap them out. And that game was played by having all the boys go into this area and wait, and the boys had to count off and give themselves a number. All the girls would take a seat here, one girl to a seat, and they also counted off and had a number. No one knew from outside or inside who had what number. And the teacher would be playing the piano, forth, and then the girls would call, send in number 4. Now, you can imagine, number 4 is a boy who's going to come into the room now. He's going to have 12, 14 girls there, and there's only going to be 1 or 2 that he wants to sit with. He wouldn't want to be near any of the others. So he's going to choose to sit next to one he would want to be close to. And of course, if he has chosen the wrong number and she doesn't happen to have the number 4, then immediately all the students clap and he must leave. Then they will say, girls will say, send in number 7, and now number 7 must sort it out. And then again, the boy is faced with, well, he doesn't want to sit with her. Well, I don't want to sit with her, yet she may be the right number. And when the right number is chosen, the boy stays and another is sent in, until finally we arrive at a point, just like musical chairs, where every female has one of the boys sitting next to them, which will create another area of teasing and poking fun because of a boy who was forced to sit with someone and he did not want to sit with that particular person. The next time you played this game on a rainy day, it would be the girls outside and the boys on the inside. And that way you would consume that time period after you had consumed your lunch in one way or another. And as long as we mention lunches, the most common lunch, of course, was carried in a lunch pail or a brown paper bag. And of course, sandwiches, leftover chicken, piece of pie, things of this type. It so happened that my mother was one of the few who still baked all of the bread for the family. And as a result, my lunches were always on home-baked bread. And for that reason, I very likely could trade a sandwich for a piece of pie or cake with someone because they all wanted to place their lips and mouth on my mother's homemade bread. That was a little advantage at that time. But either way, you carried your apples, your bananas, oranges, things, usually in a lunch pail. You might eat part of it on one of the recesses. Or, in good weather, you would go outside and you might sit in the grass somewhere, sit on the grassy bank that looked down to the road that passed the school. Sometimes we climbed maple trees because this whole area was lined with large elms and maples. Maples had lots of limbs, usually came down low. And we might climb a tree, and there'd be 4 or 5 of us eating our lunches while sitting in a tree. One time they were digging a new anchor post for the field, and the hole that they created held 6 of us. And it went down 5 feet. So for a couple of days, we ate in that hole until it was filled up with a new anchor post and plenty of stones to solidify that corner of the field. So that's the way you would have your lunch. In the wintertime, occasionally, not always, but the families would divide it up, a responsibility for furnishing a hot tray or hot dish. So you would bring your normal lunch to school, your sandwiches or whatever, and maybe 3 of the days each week, one of the mothers or fathers would stop by the school about 5 minutes of 12 and have a large tray of scalloped potatoes or baked beans or macaroni and cheese. And that way, during the coldest months, 2 or 3 days a week, you might have something hot to go with your meal. But otherwise, it was just water and the sandwiches that you brought on those occasions. And a continual trading going on for who brought what, under what circumstances, somebody swapping cake for pie and an apple for a sandwich and other things of that type. One of the interesting incidents that occurred in the spring, when I was about a 5th grader, I think, a young man who was behind me a grade, in the 4th grade, named Bill Henderson. And when the weather was nice in the spring and the grass had begun to green, we would sit at the very top of the bank and then look out at the road, and as cars might go by, wave to them and eat our sandwiches there. Bill Henderson, if he came after the others, wherever there was an opening among the boys placed on this bank, he would always come, run, jump in the air, let his fanny hit the top, then slide on the grass all the way to the bottom, and then walk back up and sit down to eat his lunch. It's something he had a habit of doing. Knowing that, and I happened to be sitting right next to him, and we plotted it out so that there would be a vacancy among us 5 boys. There would be a vacancy for Bill right next to me. And I had noticed when I peeled one of the leftover eggs from Easter, a boiled egg, that it had a very decidedly foul odor. It had begun to rot. So I peeled the egg, placed it next to me, sprinkled a little grass over it so it wouldn't be readily visible. And when Bill Henderson joined us, he ran, jumped in the air, dropped his fanny right on the berm, and went down the bank, smearing along the bank and all over his pants a rotten boiled egg. Now, this obviously requires a mental giant to figure out concoctions of this type. But either way, little amusements that you might have from time to time under those circumstances. In the wintertime also, there was the advantage not only of sliding on your lunch hour, playing other snow games, but across a 12-acre field that lay just to the south on the Springer farm, near the fence row, was a pond that filled up as a result of fall rains and then melting snow, and then when it froze solid, you had an area probably twice the size of a basketball court of ice. And so individuals would bring their skates to school, eat their sandwiches while walking across the field, and spend the lunch hour skating in one way or another. And sometimes it was smooth, sometimes there were problems with the skating, and as blood is sometimes thicker than water, there were sometimes frictions because you sometimes had a family of 5 students at the school, all from the same family. So I remember a fracas that my brother had with this Bill Henderson's older sister, and she was a year older than my brother, Donna Henderson. And there was friction between he and Bill, and he was bigger than Bill, and so his sister Donna decided to get into the action, and so a fight occurred, and my brother did not want to hit her. She was a female. But she was jerking at his clothing, and of course on the ice you end up falling down and other things. And Mrs. Smink observed all of this from the school window across the 12-acre field, but she never said anything about it because she knew a fracas of that type. I did not get into the action. I did not feel that it was fair to do that. But either way, that element of recreation was there. It wasn't until after I left the school that they paved the road along one side of the school. It still remained gravel at that time. But either way, a focal point, the one-room country school. And educationally, I might say there are certain advantages to the one-room country school. In each case, if you are a second grader, you have a brother or a friend who is studying third grade geography, and you are listening to what occurs at the table in the front when they handle their lessons. If you are a fourth grader and the sixth graders are diagramming sentences on the chalkboard, then you're already introduced to the diagramming of sentences before that occurs. You anticipate what is coming. You look forward and say, gee, fourth grade geography, we'll be studying various areas of the world, the pampas of Argentina, a little girl named Heidi who lives in Norway and goes up to the highlands as the snow melts to make the cheese. And the geography is told through the life of someone your age in another place. You look forward to that and you anticipate being able to study what an older brother or an older student in the school is studying ahead of you. So I think there's a kind of cultural diffusion that occurs in the one-room country school that would not occur, shall we say, in a classroom in which you were solely sixth graders or fifth graders, things of that type. Now, it is possible to engage in any amount of mischief in the one-room country. Oh, one other game I would like to comment on. It's called Ante-I Over. It's played with a softball. And you divide up and have half on each side of the school, and you throw the ball over the school. And on the other side, on the honor system, someone must catch it. If they don't catch it, then they yell Ante-I Over, and they throw it. And then someone on the other side must catch it. If it is caught, then individuals divide up and run around one side or the other, holding one person who caught it, holding the ball behind them. Then the minute they charge around the school, the others must defend themselves and hope that they are not hit with the thrown ball, because if they are, then a point is scored. Those who ran around will now take that side, the others will go to the other side, but the person who was hit must go to the other side now, and they have more people on their team, don't they? The aim of all of this is a process of elimination, if you can possibly have it that way. So again, on the theory of the musical chairs and the elimination one way, or the building up of one side as opposed to the other side. All that element is there as well. Now, I would like to tell you an example of the kind of mischief that one might carry out in a school of this type. And you've probably read many cases of inkwells on a desk, and we did not have inkwells, but of the boy who would take the pigtails of the girl in front of him and dip them in the inkwell. I read about that. I heard it discussed many times, but we did not have inkwells at that school. Too modern. However, a young lady sat in front of me who was in my grade, and there were only two girls and myself in my grade as I moved from second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. The same, three people in all these grades. And when I was in the fifth grade, I sat across the aisle from a boy named Bobby Minnis, whose farm was right across from the school to the north. And of course, it is your wont to pick on girls one way or another. And so we always did that, of course, as we chased them in with the snow into their outdoor toilet. So in this case, we decided, because the girl sitting in front of me, and if she's alive today, bless her soul, Patty Cousins, her stringy hair hung right on my desk as she sat in front of me. And so Bobby Minnis and I decided that we would introduce some creatures to her hair. The Minnis family did not run any sheep at all. They milked a few cows, farmed. But on our farm, we always had 60 or more head of sheep, and we sheared them each spring and sold the wool. Now, sheeps can develop ticks. And ticks are about half the size of a ladybug, and they're kind of a reddish, rusty, brownish color. And in order to avoid those ticks, you have a large dip container, very, very large, probably would hold several hundreds of gallons of fluid, and you mix the fluid, the water, with a fluid that would kill the ticks, and then you took the sheep up some steps in front of it, and two of the large members of the farm or visitors that would come to help you, and you would loft the sheep into it. The only way they could escape is to swim forward and go out the other end where there were steps that they could reach. And this was a large zinc metal container. And it might be moved from farm to farm so that dips could be done so that every farmer didn't have to own a sheep dip. And that's the way you killed the ticks, was to toss them in, and it soaked into the wool and things and would kill the ticks. Now, before the ticks were all dead and so forth, I examined the sheep. And Bobby Minnis gave me, because his father smoked and nobody smoked in my family, but used those wooden matches, and he used to have those little boxes with these slide open and slide closed. So Bobby furnished me with one of those boxes. And that evening, while doing the milking and other chores in the barn, I pried the wool of several sheep and picked up a tick. And first I put some wool in the box, a little bit of wool in the bottom. And there I picked up 5 sheep ticks. And then in the little box with the wool, I took them to school the next day. And Bobby, sitting across me, watched. Patty Cousin's hair was hanging on the desk before me. And then I opened the box, allowed one of the ticks to go on my finger, leaned over and fed it into the hair. It immediately moved up and out of sight. Then number 2. And eventually 5 ticks found a new home in Patty Cousin's hair. Now, we thought there would be tremendous repercussions from this, things that we could hear about, and nobody would know who had done it. And the disillusioning thing was, there was never any mention of it. Patty Cousins never said anything. No other student said anything. Her sister didn't say anything about it. And we have no idea where the ticks went. Bobby Minnis's comment was, well, she probably didn't notice it, and they felt so at home there that they didn't cause any problems. We don't know if that is the case at all. But either way, that's an example of the kind of mischief at the one-room country school. Another game that could be played at the one-room country school, because all boys of any size, 2nd grade and on up, would own a jackknife, a very, very important commodity. And a game was called Mumbly Peg. And all you do is take a stick and mark out an area on the ground that might be 3 feet by 3 feet, and then 2 are playing it. And then in that area that you've marked out, first you start with throwing the blade once like this. If it sticks, fine. If it doesn't stick, you lose your turn. If it sticks, then depending on the angle of the blade, you may go directly across from one side of the square to the other, and that is your territory. So you've gained or won that much of the square. Then it's someone else's, it's your opponent's turn, and he must do that too, and the first time would be like this. If he doesn't make it, the next time he throws, it must be in that fashion. The second round, for somebody who has been successful and has carved out some territory, remember, the line must be drawn according to the angle of the knife. Then you place the knife here, take the top of this way and go, and you flip it in. If it sticks, depending on the angle of the blade, you may carve off that amount. And the whole aim, of course, is for you to gain, because of your throwing or flipping the knife, the largest amount of territory, you win the game. If it can't be won with 2 or 3 flips, the next flip is the elbow, and the next flip is off the shoulder. But no one can do this each time. Only once, if you're successful that time, in that fashion. So that was another typical outdoor game that you might play at the one-room country school. We were always restricted not to climb on the roof of the school. That was a no-no, and the only time it was permitted was under supervision, because when playing the game with a softball of ante-eye over, sometimes the ball would bounce and go into the belfry arch. And then one with the teacher's supervision, was commissioned to climb onto the lean-to, go up on the roof of the school, and take out the ball, as well as 2 or 3 others that may already be there and done in that fashion. So much for one-room country school, mischief, and other things. The school did not have any large amount of funds, and so we didn't receive regular publications except one that was called Current Events, and it came every 2 weeks, and it was 4 sides, and then was pinned to a bulletin board for all individuals to see, pinned up there with a tack. The current events cost the school money. I do not know how much, but the money for current events subscription was raised by the students each spring by selling seeds. And they would merely ride their bikes or walk around to all the farmers and sell flower seeds and garden seeds and other things of one kind or another. And in doing that, they raised enough money to pay for the subscription to the current events fold-up that we placed on the bulletin board. When I was in the 3rd grade, one of the articles showed a picture of an individual named Hussein. And he is the same Hussein who is the king of Jordan today. At that time, he was just about 9 months younger than me, which he still is today, of course. But I looked at the picture, I realized his age. I was in the 3rd grade. He was approximately the same age as I was. There was a write-up about him indicating that he was a king. And I thought, to be 3rd grade level and to be a king would mean you could have ice cream 5 times a day if you were a king. There wouldn't be any doubt about that. So I never forgot his name. And as I grew older, went to school, read more about history, world affairs, I would see him on movie tone news. Long before television, you had little news clips that came with films when you went to a theater in the town. Maybe 5 minutes. That's the only way you actually saw pictures of individuals, except still shots in a paper where you might see them. And so I followed the career of Hussein, and he's still with us today. I always have a soft spot in my heart for him because of having read that particular current event and following his name throughout history up to modern times. He's one of the few monarchs of an important Middle Eastern state who still survives in the form of monarchy. And he isn't always safe based on the number of terrorists and Arab nationalists of one kind or another who might like to eliminate King Hussein. He also has a sophisticated Western education and, as you know, is a jet pilot as well. So I think he's well thought of in the West, but he has to watch his conduct at all times because he does live and rule a nation that is in the Middle East. Now let's move on to some other topics involving this particular rural area and talk about another structure, and this time not in a rural area, but in the 100 to 104 population town of Fulton. Fulton was simply a 4 corners. It had 4 stop signs, no traffic lights or anything of that type. There were some lights at night on posts, moving, let's say, a half a mile this way and that way out of each entrance to the town. There was only 1 square block apart from that, and it never had an address. It was known as Pigtail Alley, and there were homes around that square block. Otherwise, simply 4 corners as you come together. On one corner, there was a general store. A smaller store on the other corner, which sometimes was and sometimes was not open. Then there was a gas station on one corner, a gas station on the other, and that took care of your 4 corners. There was a small office in which a retired veteran had an insurance business, and he shared it with a barber. And then there was a modest hardware of sorts and general junk of one kind or another. And then there was a structure which was simply a house and an anteway. In the anteway, there were 3 tables where you could buy ice cream to be served by a fellow named Johnny Sherman, who was a widower. And in the rear was the only place that beer was sold in Fulton. And that was not sold for consumption there, so everybody knew who went to the rear door to purchase beer or walk out with it. Because in a small town or a rural area like that, gossip travels very, very fast. As a matter of fact, the teacher at Fulton School, Mrs. Mordyke, about every 10 days stopped in front of Johnny Sherman's, opened a trunk on her way home from school, took out a case of empty bottles, went into Johnny Sherman's, came out with a case of full bottles and put them in a trunk for her husband, Herb. So that means Herb drank a case of beer about every 10 days. Everybody knew that, and everybody commented upon it. I knew that when I was 4 years old, just hearing table talk that you would have at any farm breakfast or dinner table, whatever. So everybody was aware of that. Then there was modest farm implement area or for repairs of one kind or another. Then there was a little meat market run by a woman named Mert Lloyd. She sold a little bread, a little bit of meat. She was a widow, and she survived just fine that way. Then what was called a hotel but was not a hotel, but some individuals who were hired men for farmers lived in the upstairs of this two-story structure. And it was separated from the little smaller store by a grass area in which there were two pits for double horseshoes to be played there. And the individual who ran one of the gas stations was a champion horseshoe pitcher. And he always appeared at the St. Joe County Fair in competition and quite often won ribbons. He would appear at the Kalamazoo County Fair each year and often win ribbons. He was the horseshoe star of our particular area. Then there was a two-story structure which was used as a lodge of sorts and called Western Star, and people met there once a month and had meetings of one kind or another. No one I knew was a member of the lodge, so it was a center point for other areas in Kalamazoo County. Then besides houses and the funeral parlor, which did not take up any more space than a house, the funeral parlor, and then everything else was houses except for two churches. And we had a Methodist church and we had a Reformed church. Very, very important institutions in the town. There was also one other structure behind the Sinclair station. It was called the Town Hall. It was one story, but a little higher than 8 feet. It was of brick and had a large opening so you could back a vehicle into it, as well as a walk-in door. If you entered the town hall, you would see something about the fourth the size of the surface of a high school basketball playing floor for basketball. And in the first corner, as you went in, you would see stacked wooden folding chairs, varnished, blonde colored. And of course, everyone was assumed if you were attending something, you gain your own chair and you set it up appropriately. The town hall was used for elections. I'll talk about elections a little later. And it was used for Farm Bureau meetings every other Wednesday night. And that meant potluck, so the farmers would bring food to share and have their Farm Bureau meeting there. On a different night, the Junior Farm Bureau would meet, and those are all the young people who are young marrieds or not married yet, but would be considered adults. They planned different activities, and when they planned activities, most likely it was not for the town hall, but for someone who had cleaned their barn or had built a new barn, so that they might have what we call barn dances. And there were always plenty of individuals in the community who knew how to play a fiddle, and you could have the music you needed for a barn dance. I went to many of them, and they're fun. And when you're a boy, you lay up in a haymow and watch everybody dancing and take advantage of all the donuts and the cider in the 10-gallon milk cans. Cider is another topic we could talk about in the future. Now, this town hall was very, very important focal point, and it wasn't until I was about 10 or 11 that they cooperated, put together a fire department committee, all volunteer, and raised the funds to purchase a fire engine, which they then parked in the town hall. And of course, each time there were meetings, they had to move the fire engine out until the meeting was over and then back it in. Only certain members were on the phone line to receive a call from different points from Fulton in case there was a fire, and you had an all-volunteer group. Also, the town hall was used for meetings of Boy Scouts and Cub Scouts, and we did not have very active chapters of those groups. It usually depended upon who you had in the local community that was new, who had experience in those areas, and that very likely would be any new preacher that you happen to have. And we once had a preacher when I was in the 5th grade and joined the Cub Scouts, and unfortunately, this preacher's basic experience was the military. And he had just cashiered from the military about a year before. And so 90% of the scouting activity we did, besides exercises in the book and learning how to Morse code and other signals of this type, tying knots. Yes, we did all those things, but I would say we spent 70% of our time being drilled because of this individual's military background. He wanted us all to know how to march in unison, about face, and halt, and attention, and all these other things, which usually doesn't go, I don't think, with scouting as such. The best aspect of scouting, operating out of that town hall, was when you planned a field trip of one kind or another, where you may or may not stay overnight, but in a local forest that would be within a mile or two away. But you were to go into the forest and play all sorts of games of hiding from each other in groups, and then leave signals to see if anybody can track you and follow you. And then also the cooking outdoors, where you might take an elderberry branch and take dough that your mother had made for you, wrap it around it, and then twist it over the fire until the bread had cooked over an open fire, and then you could eat it. All of this, of course, to do outdoors is a great deal of fun. And so scouting was used in that way, and you had the advantage if you happened to have someone who would serve as a scout leader from time to time. Now, I indicated that the town hall would also be the location for local elections. And as I recall our local elections, right, the most important man at that election was an elderly gentleman who also served as an umpire quite often for ball games. Because you see, as we will explain, if you have an umpire for pickup ball games on a Sunday afternoon in a town that size, and you have all sorts of older teenagers and young adults who participate and competing with each other, you must have an umpire. And the umpire must be an individual who is so respected in your community that no one would dare argue with them over a call. And of course, you need one in the field and you need one behind the plate. So most of the time, the umpires were either this Ben Weedle, who was chairman of the election board, had a farm 2.5 miles to the north, or it was a fellow who lived a quarter of a mile from our farm across the way named Harry Lawrence, who was a county supervisor representing our township. Also sold some insurance because he was too old to farm, but he still milked 3 cows, had a large chuck garden, and all the other things that a farmer would have, and his wife, Jessie, made wonderful cookies. They had no children, so they were very kind to us whenever we went there because they didn't have children. And also he was a very sincere and serious Detroit Tiger baseball fan. So the games were always on radio at Harry Lawrence's house or on the porch if it were summertime. He would be an umpire. And another who lived 3/4 of a mile from us named Cad Harrison. Again, somebody who was held in such esteem that under no circumstances would anyone stoop to argue with him over any call that might be made. That's very, very important in keeping discipline in a sport, especially pickup of any kind. So there were ball games of that type, but let's get back to Ben Weedle. Ben Weedle had a very long hook nose. And the first time I saw a nose that looked just like that is the nose of the head of a family in Urbino, Italy, when I was in college. And I saw the picture of the leader of the Montefeltri family. And it's a typical Renaissance portrait, only it's a side view. And I looked at it, and the minute I saw it, and it had been years since I had lived in Michigan, my first words were, Ben Weedle, because he had the same type of nose. Now, Ben Weedle always wore one of those dress hats that are made of straw. And he would always have that hat on. He was bald, right? And so you had this bill coming out like this, and then the large hooked nose. Now, at 6 o'clock in the morning on election day in a small town of Fulton, Ben Weedle would be there. The board had their tables out, their chairs to count ballots when people came in to vote. And Ben Weedle would step outside the small door of that town hall. It's the only time I would ever see this occur. It's the only time I ever saw this bell. And he had a large bell in his hand, and he would stand there and shout as loud as he could, "Hear ye, the polls are now open, hear ye," and he would do it twice. That night at 7 o'clock, Ben Weedle would step out and repeat twice the same ritual. Always. So it had to be official. Everything was done in an official way. Now, election day was a very good day for kids, even in a town that small, because everyone came to town sometime to vote. And the total population of the town was only 104, so you probably only have 30 voters in the town. So the bulk of your voters are coming from 3 miles in any direction from the town, from farms, to vote. And if everybody's coming into town that day, you want to do something to make it commodious and comfortable for them, as you would in typical rural style. And so on election day, and they alternated, let's say on this election day in 1941, in the fall of 41, the Methodist Church in their large basement would have lunch. And then the best of cooks in your township would cooperate together and cook the lunch. The lunch cost 50 cents. And you could have chicken and dumplings and pie and biscuits and mashed potatoes, all the typical farm type of fare for 50 cents. My brother and I always were allowed to eat free because my mother was always one of the cooks at the Methodist Church. That evening, for people who came to vote in the evening, the Reformed Church in its basement also had dinner. Again, was 50 cents for all you could eat. The next round of elections, Methodist Church would have the evening one, the Reformed Church. Again, the best cooks. After all, the person you're going to invite to work for dinners and lunches on election day is that woman best known for her fried chicken, that woman best known for her pickles. That's another topic we'll talk about in the future, pickles. So you choose the best. Also, it brought all of these individuals into town in the fall on election day, which means if you're a kid, you live on a farm, the closest farm to you where there's another close friend is a mile away, a mile and a half away. Now you have a situation where you spend a large chunk of the middle of the day and your noon meal and your evening meal in a situation when all sorts of other young people are in town just like you. So that made it a very special time. So election day was one of my favorite days in town. Another might be field day, and that's when the one-room country schools in any direction, there might be 4 or 5 of them coming together in Fulton for a day in the spring in which you did not have classes, and everyone came. There we had poles set up, crossbar for pole vaulting and the high jump with a sawdust pit right next to the only baseball diamond in the town that was for general use. There was another one next to Fulton School. And then, of course, races were run and everything divided by grades. Interesting thing is that as you move through the lower grades, it's always girls and boys ran separately in races. But by the time you reach the 5th or 6th grade, you find out that there are some girls that can outrun the boys. And so they mixed it by the time you reached 5th and 6th grade. And if you came in third, right, yellow, you could come in first and get the blue ribbon rather than the red. And the important thing was to have across your chest between the broad jump, standing broad jump, running broad jump, pole vault, anything else you did, to have as many ribbons across you as you could. And then it was a large picnic at noon, and so it took up the whole day like a school day, but a very much a fun day for young people because you had youth from 5 different schools all in one place at the same time. There was very little athletic competition between the schools. Maybe once a school year, our school would journey on a Friday afternoon to Fulton, a 1.25 miles away, and there would be a softball game between players at their school and players at our school. Plenty of substitutions, you need a good umpire, no arguing, correct? And in those situations, of course, the ball team was mixed because in a school that only had 28 students, there's no way you can play and have 9 players and have them all boys. You wouldn't want to, because the person who had the biggest hands might be that girl, Virginia Tarker, who lived a 1/4 mile from the school with fingers this long, and you wanted her on first base, didn't you? In most cases, nobody had any mitts anyway, so having large hands and being able to catch in that fashion was very, very important. But the one-room country school, again, was the focal point for all of these activities. I remember many times walking home when there were board meetings held at the school. And if you wonder what a school board does, well, one of the things the school board has to do is hire the teacher. And the teacher is most likely to come from your community and be the type that I described. My 6th grade, it was a local pastor from a town 12 miles to the north. Had the education, they needed a teacher. right? So he, in effect, had two jobs, didn't he? Then it was the wife of the undertaker for some time, the wife of a local farmer when it was Mrs. Smink. But they had the adequate education, the ability to play the piano, and all the things that went with that. So the board had to raise the funds in the farming area around there in order to pay for the teacher. I have no idea, and I would love to know what a teacher's salary would have been in 1940 in Waukesha Township. Probably was $600 a year. I don't know. But Mrs. Burke, the one I had for 3 years, her husband, the undertaker, in the wintertime, when it was extremely cold, would drive down ahead of her and start the fire in the pot-bellied stove an hour before she showed up for school. So that was always done and benefited the students as well. But he was a kindly man that everyone respected. But he was never the umpire. Only certain people were allowed to be the umpire at games. And then the board would also have to determine how the money will be raised and how it will be paid, because each fall a large truck must come from a neighboring town where coal is distributed, and with a chute, shovel it down the chute through a side window in the lean-to and fill the bin with coal for the coming year to make it through the winter. There was some wood, but we used not very much wood, only for starting fires and other things. Generally, it was coal because it radiated well, and that money had to be raised as well. They did not raise other monies that I know of. I can't recall. The school was never painted in the years I attended, either outside or inside, and most maintenance was volunteer maintenance of one kind or another. If it involved patching roofs or anything else, a new rope for the bell, situations of that type. Once things would be donated, such as Life magazine or Look magazine or Collier's magazine, and those would be available for students to read there. Otherwise, everybody purchased their own materials as a student. Each fall, all students would go to the county seat, Kalamazoo. There was a state bookstore which provided exactly the required texts as devised by the superintendent of schools for the entire county. And the parents then would lay out the money for all the books that their children needed and any papers that they needed or any things of that type. So all of it was confined in that fashion. So the school was not an expensive operation, but obviously was a burden to the farmers, and they are the ones in their board meetings that would have to arrange for all of those expenditures. When they had meetings at night, particularly in the fall, this was only 3/4 of a mile from our farm, and so we would go there and walk at night and then on home. And I remember it was kind of scary on moonlit nights walking home from where the school board met with a friend, because it would be exactly the same time in which all the corn had been cut and was now in shocks. Or if it hadn't been cut and there was any breeze at all, dried corn leaves rustle and make lots of sounds. And I think the time that I was most scared walking home about 8:30 or 9 at night, very dark, the moon was out, cornfields on both sides, pumpkins in the cornfields. But the interesting thing was, at that very time was the first time I had just read The Legend of Sleepy Hollow about the headless horseman. And to walk home at night from the school with the corn stalks rustling, eerie, the moon rising, the shadows created by all of that, very, very eerie effect. But either way, we have consumed our time here now, and we will stop at this point. And maybe in the future, it'll be possible we take up other topics that involve the rural Midwest, particularly in Waukesha Township in southern Michigan. Thank you.